Languages can be classified in various ways: syntactically, on the basis of their word order and their relationships between heads and modifiers; phonologically, on the basis of several segmental and suprasegmental parameters. The morphological classification, which constitutes the focus of this e-lecture, defines languages on the basis of the inflectional structure of their words. How this is done and what types of languages can be identified using this structural parameter will be discussed in the following. However, first we have to solve one essential question. Why is it inflection and not any other morphological process on the basis of which languages can be classified morphologically? Well, let's discuss this for a moment. The following criteria, which have primarily been based on present-day English, have been put forward to distinguish inflection from word formation, such as derivation. The stability of word class is one criterion. Inflectional processes, as you know from other e-lectures of this channel, do not change the word class of the stem, irrespective of the type of morphological operation involved: prefixing, suffixing, vowel change, and so on and so forth. A second criterion concerns the stability of stress pattern. Inflection, at least in present-day English, we know there are counterexamples from other languages, does not involve a change of the stress pattern of the stem. The third criterion is referred to as semantic transparency. Inflection is semantically transparent, that is, the meaning that is created by a morphological operation is stable. And then we have the criterion of productivity. Now, a morphological process is fully productive if it applies to all members of a specific class. Hence, inflectional processes are highly productive. Word formation processes, by contrast, are by and large not. Let's look at an example. In present-day English, for example, all verbs can have the third person singular or can denote the third person singular. But not all verbs can be nominalized. NMLZ is the abbreviation. So verbs like reina or sima, etc. are impossible. And this sort of nominalization process is even different across languages. Thus, it is the last criterion which makes it almost impossible to compare languages on the basis of their word formation principles. All we could do is assess the word formation complexity of a language on the whole. But that's not normally used as a typological parameter. So let us turn our attention to the inflectional classification of the world's languages. Now, the inflectional possibilities of most languages can be defined in terms of a continuum, which is illustrated by this vertical line here. At one extreme of this continuum, we find the so-called analytic or isolating languages, whose words have little or no internal structure. At the other extreme, we find the synthetic languages, which do allow the analysis of their words into smaller parts or morphs. Let us look at these two extremes in more detail. Now, analytic languages, which are also referred to as isolating, generally do not allow the segmentation of their words. That is, the words of an analytic language cannot or hardly be split into smaller units. Thus, a typical analytic language is a language where there is a one-to-one correspondence between words and morphemes. Well-known examples of analytic languages are Vietnamese or Chinese? Well, let us look at these two languages in more detail. Here is a sentence in Vietnamese. In fact, it's the sentence most of you know from the VLC language index. The man gives the woman the book. And here is the Vietnamese equivalent. Let's listen first.
Người đàn ông đưa cho người phụ nữ quyển sách.
And as you can see quite clearly, each morph or word, well, there's hardly any difference between them, corresponds to one translation or to one grammatical function. So clearly a one-to-one relationship between words and morphemes. Well, and here is the same sentence in Chinese. Let's listen again.
男人给女人一本书.
And again, we have syllables that stand for words, that stand for morphemes. You might want to argue that nanren and nuren are compounds. Okay, but we said earlier on, word formation is not a criterion for the typological classification of the languages of the world. So clearly, Vietnamese and Chinese are analytic languages. Let's now look at the synthetic type of languages. Synthetic languages, by contrast, as I said earlier on, do allow a segmentation of their words into morphs. Again, I would like to illustrate this with two examples. Here is an example from Turkish. Adamların, which means men's in the plural. And clearly this word can be split into the following morphs. Adam, which is the stem and means man. Lar, which stands for the plural, and in, which stands for the genitive. So it's genitive plural. And here is a sentence again. The man gives the woman the book.
Adam kadına kitabı veriyor.
And as you can see, we can subdivide some words into morphs. For example, kaduna, where the a stands for the dative. Kitabu, where kitab is the stem and u is the accusative case marker. And verior, which can be subdivided into veri, the stem, and yor, the present tense singular affix. So Turkish is clearly a synthetic language, and it can be placed down here on our continuum. Let's now look at another example, my own mother tongue, German. The word Menschen can be subdivided into Mensch plus its final suffix, normally phonologically represented just by an alveolar nasal consonant, Menschen. Well, and here is the sentence, der Mann gibt der Frau das Buch. And as you can see, we can subdivide, well, at least one word into two morphs, gives, where gib is the stem, and the t stands for the third person singular present tense. The remaining words incorporate the various morphological and grammatical functions. But German clearly is synthetic too. But what is the difference between these two languages? Let us now look at the function of the morphs in both cases, German and Turkish, the affixes. In Turkish we had adamların, which can be subdivided into adam, lar and in, and as you can see, we can clearly associate one particular function with the relevant morphs. In German this is relatively difficult. Now here we have the final suffix, however this time the meaning is not so clear. The final suffix can denote the plural in the nominative case, plural genitive, plural dative, plural accusative, and even the genitive singular. So the difference between Turkish and German is that the bound morphs in Turkish are functionally unambiguous, whereas in German the bound morphs exhibit several grammatical functions. Thus, depending on the function of the morphs we can identify in a language, we can define two types of synthetic language. On the one hand, we have the so-called agglutinating synthetic languages, such as Turkish, where the morphs are by and large functionally unambiguous. In such an agglutinating language, some people call it agglutinative, a word may consist of more than one morph, but the boundaries between the morphs are always clear-cut. Furthermore, a given morph has mostly a reasonably invariant shape so that its identification is in most cases straightforward. Another well-known example of an agglutinating language is Japanese. It's also highly synthetic, so let's place it over here. The agglutinating languages can be contrasted with the fusional languages such as German. Here the dependent morphs often have several grammatical functions associated with them. In fusional languages, some people refer to them as inflecting or inflective, there are no clear-cut boundaries between the morphs. Also, several grammatical functions, several grammatical properties are often fused together to give a single unsegmentable morph. Most Indo-European languages are fusional. For example, Latin, which is highly synthetic, is fusional in many ways. Or Russian is also fusional, perhaps less synthetic than Latin but more synthetic than German. Well, what about present-day English? Well, English has traditionally been defined as a synthetic fusional language too, perhaps over here. But as many of you know from the historical development of English, English is becoming more and more analytic, so perhaps it would be legitimate to place English up there, because English has now many analytic words, words that cannot be subdivided any further, words such as conjunctions, prepositions, pronouns, etc. Note that it is often difficult to assign a language to the agglutinating or fusional type. Many synthetic languages have properties of both types. A further but very special type of synthetic language is referred to as polysynthetic. Now, a polysynthetic or incorporating language is one in which the verb and the subject or object of a sentence may be included within a single word. In other words, the main functional elements of clause structure are joined, that is, incorporated in one word and have no independent existence. There are three types of polysynthetic languages. For example, the concatenative type, which you can see over here. An example would be Eskimo Aleut, where there's a heavy reliance on concatenation, that is chaining of inflectional and derivational affixes in the formation of words, well, or sentences, you might argue. Then we have the compositional type, where content words, especially verbal stems, are incorporated into more complex constructions. Examples can be found in the Papuan languages. And finally, we have the slot type, a type of language that determines fixed positions for elements that can be obtained by members of the same paradigm, so slots where certain elements belong. Slot type languages, or slot type polysynthetic languages to be precise, can be found among the North American and Australian indigenous languages. In all polysynthetic languages, the nature of words is extremely difficult to define. So this is another argument for morphemes as linguistic units rather than words. Let's finally illustrate the degree of synthesis of a language. As I said, the distinction between analytic and synthetic is a continuum ranging from the most radically analytic or isolating type to the most highly synthetic, perhaps polysynthetic type of language. The position of a language on this continuum can be determined by calculating its degree of synthesis, that is, the number of morphemes per word in a random text sample of the language. Now the random text sample which we have available in the language index of the Virtual Linguistics campus is of course the famous story The North Wind and the Sun, which has been recorded more than 1,000 times for you to work with. So let's take the first sentence and only the first clause to illustrate the calculation of the degree of synthesis. Now here is Chinese. This is the first sentence. The North Wind and the Sun were disputing which was the stronger in Chinese. Let's listen first.
有一回，北风和太阳正在那争论，谁的本事更大。
And here is the same sentence in German. So I can read it myself because I'm a native speaker of German. Einst stritten sich Nordwind und Sonne, wer von ihnen beiden wohl der Stärkere wäre. Well, you might want to stop the e-lecture here and calculate the degree of synthesis by calculating the number of morphemes and divide them by the number of words. So now it's up to you. Okay, have you got the results? Well, here they are. The degree of synthesis in Chinese is clearly 1.0, the lowest figure you can get. We have 19 words and each word can clearly be associated with a particular type of meaning, and so we have a relationship of 1-to-1 between morphemes and words. You might want to argue perhaps that Tentai is in fact two morphemes, so but one word, but that's a little bit critical and disputed in Chinese. Well, in German we can clearly count 14 words but 20 morphemes. You see, for example, that we have two morphemes in stritten, where Stritt is the stem, which involves a vocalic change, by the way, of streiten, and n is the affix which fuses the third person and the singular into its structure. Or look at this one, ihnen, them, plus dative plural in the affix. So clearly German is far more synthetic, and the higher this value will be, the more synthetic a language is. Well, here's my suggestion to you. Look at the language index on the Virtual Linguistics campus, load a language, load the story The North Wind and the Sun, and calculate the degree of synthesis of that language. Let's summarize. The morphological or structural parameter of language classification is straightforward. In examining the inflectional possibilities of a language, we can classify languages as analytic versus synthetic. And if a language is synthetic, we can further examine the type of synthesis. If the morphemes that make up the words of a language are functionally unambiguous, the language is synthetic agglutinating. If not, it is a synthetic fusional language. Well, and in specific cases where whole sentences are expressed via inflectional morphemes, we have a special type, the polysynthetic type of language. However, we should never forget that in all cases the structural parameter is not binary but continuous. There are several ways of classifying languages: phonologically, on the basis of several segmental and suprasegmental parameters, or structurally, on the basis of the internal structure of their words. The syntactic classification, which is the focus of this e-lecture, defines languages on the basis of their word order. And the relationship between heads and modifiers. How this is done and what types of languages can be identified using this parameter will be discussed in the following. But what exactly is word order? Well, let's illustrate this on the basis of a simple declarative sentence in present-day English. In this example, the order of the words would be adverb, determiner, adjective, noun, verb, pronoun, determiner, and noun. So this is the order of the words. However, in looking at each category, too many possibilities would emerge and too few generalizations across languages could be made. Thus, word order is not defined as the ordering of the words within a sentence, but as the ordering of the functional elements within a sentence. Now, these functional elements here, of course, are adverbial, subject, verb, object, and complement. Two of these functions, however, are not representative for the classification of the languages of the world. The adverbial, for example, is often mobile. We could say, my old friend called me a fool yesterday. And mobility, of course, is not a good parameter for a classification in terms of ordering. And the object complement here, a fool, is by and large dependent on specific verbs. And by the way, there's also a subject complement. Hence, these two functional elements are normally excluded from the typological classification of the languages of the world, and we get as a result the three central syntactic functions subject, verb, and object as the main parameters for the typological classification of the languages of the world in terms of syntax. Now, this provides us with 6 theoretically possible word order patterns. For example, we could think of languages that exhibit the subject, verb, object order, or languages that use a subject, object, verb ordering pattern, or languages that use the verb, subject, object pattern. So these are 3 possibilities. Further possibilities could be a verb, object, subject pattern. Then we could think of languages that use the object in the first position, then the subject comes second and the verb is final, or the other way around, object, verb, subject structures. So these are the theoretically possible patterns, and it is quite interesting that the majority of the languages of the world uses this pattern, where the subject in each of these cases precedes the object. Patterns where the subject follows the object are marginal. So it is the first 3 ordering types that constitute a parameter for the classification of the languages of the world. Let's illustrate this using actual examples. Now, we all know that English is a language which exhibits the SVO word order. Turkish is an example of an SOV language, and the Arabic languages, here illustrated by the Saudi Arabian flag, are languages where the verb comes first. So these are our 3 main types. All other types are marginal. For example, VOS is exhibited by a language called Malagasy, spoken in Madagascar, and even less representative is OVS, spoken in Brazil. The language is called Hiscariana, and it only has a handful of native speakers. And an OSV order is often associated with a language spoken in the Caucasian area, The language is called Kabardian, but it is highly disputed whether the word order is really OSV. So these are the main patterns, and we know that SVO, SOV, VSO constitute the majority of the languages of the world. But how do we establish the basic word order of a language? How do we find out whether a language is SVO, SOV, etc.? Well, let's illustrate this using present-day English. In present-day English, declarative sentences, and these are the sentence types we're using, the following word order types can be found, or not. Well, we know that English typically has SVO patterns, a sentence like the man saw the woman. What about SOV? Well, SOV is impossible in present-day English. You wouldn't find an example that exhibits this word order pattern. VSO, the third of the majority types, is possible in present-day English. Never has the man seen the woman. However, as you may note, there is an adverbial that is fronted. So we have never, the adverbial, then has, the inflected component of the verb, the man, the subject, and the woman, the object. However, this construction is restricted in many ways. The adverbial has to be negative. Never has the man seen the woman works, but very often has the man seen the woman does not. The next ordering pattern would be the VOS order. Never has the woman seen the man. Superficially looks fine. However, if you remember, the woman is now the object, and we can illustrate this by replacing the object with a pronoun, with a case mark pronoun, and then you can clearly see that never has her seen he is totally impossible. Now, the fifth ordering pattern, OSV, is normally not used in present-day English. The woman, the man saw. However, there are cases of object fronting where the subject is case marked. The subject has to be a pronoun. So something like the woman he saw is possible, but as you see, the subject is now a pronoun which is case marked. And finally, the OVS word order is impossible. Again, you would first of all see, oh, the woman saw the man is possible, but however, this would be an SVO example, but with the woman as the object, it is of course impossible. As you can see, if you replace it by a pronoun, her, saw, he, is clearly impossible. Now, what do we do with these findings? Well, we could say that in present-day English declarative sentences, the overwhelming majority of the sentences exhibits the SVO word order, that is the first type. Thus, present-day English is an SVO language. And this can easily be supported by the analysis of English text corpora. However, as we would see later, we have to be careful here. Now, over and above the basic word order patterns, there are a number of so-called head modifier constructions whose internal ordering is highly revealing with regard to the basic configuration of a language. The typologist Joseph Greenberg found out in the middle of the 20th century that there are typical correlations between the order of the basic functional elements like subject, verb, object, and these head modifier patterns. So let's look at such head modifier relationships in more detail. Now, of course, if you look at them, you have two possibilities. The head can precede the modifier, or the modifier can precede the head. Now, here are some examples. Probably the most well-known head modifier construction is the verb-object construction. Since verbs determine the choice and, depending on the language, the case of their objects, they constitute the heads in such constructions, and their objects are the modifiers. Well, here are two examples. Whereas in present-day English, the verb always precedes the object, so you could say something like, to eat rice is one of my goals today. In Japanese, the object, that is the modifier, precedes its head. Kome o tabe. Here is another example. The relationship between nouns and adjectives. Nouns determine the choice, maybe the gender and the case of their adjectives. So nouns are clearly the heads in such constructions, and adjectives the modifiers. Now let's look at English. Well, here the situation is a little bit difficult. We have exceptional constructions where the noun precedes, the head precedes the modifier, as in the president-elect. However, you would agree with me that the majority of constructions of this type have the adjective, that is the modifier, in the first position, that is a modifier head construction. In Japanese, the situation is clear. Okina Hon, the big book, is clearly organized as a modifier head pattern. So in English here, this is slightly problematic. Another well-known head modifier pattern concerns adpositions. But what are adpositions? Well, adpositions, the term adposition is a head term for, on the one hand, prepositions, where the adposition precedes its noun phrase, or postpositions, where the adposition follows its noun phrase. Now, obviously, the adposition is always the head of such constructions because, again, depending on the language, it determines the choice and maybe the case of the noun phrase that has to follow. So, adpositions are heads. Well, and how is this organized in English and Japanese? Well, in English, clearly we have prepositions only in the book. So the preposition, the adpositional type, precedes its modifier, and in Japanese it's the other way around, hongo nakani, where the noun phrase, the modifier, precedes its head. So we have postpositions in Japanese. Now, the typologist Joseph Greenberg, as I already mentioned, found out that there are typical correlations between the basic word order, SVO, SOV, VSO, etc., and these head modifier patterns. For example, he found out by investigating a large number of languages that SOV languages typically have modifier head patterns. So these are the patterns that are used in SOV languages. Whereas languages where either the verb precedes, is at the beginning of a sentence, or languages like SVO typically have head modifier patterns. So these are then the ideal correlations between the basic word order and the organization of heads and modifiers. Well, let's look at the languages that we are interested in. Here is English. Now, English is clearly a head modifier language. The verb precedes its object. English has prepositions. The adjectival parameter is a little bit problematic. We have modifier head constructions in things like the big book, but we also have adjectival constructions where the adjective follows the noun, as in the president-elect, but the majority of the ordering patterns is head modifier. Now, the other way around, Japanese is an example. In Japanese we have modifier head patterns very clearly. So Japanese would be then an SOV language, whereas English is almost exclusively SVO. Sometimes there are languages that represent both. For example, in German we find both patterns, object-verb constructions in subordinate clauses and verb-object constructions in main clauses. We have adjectives that precede their heads, but we also have prepositions and postpositions in constructions like in dem Buch we have a preposition, and meiner Meinung nach we have a postposition. So German is obviously a mixed type language. Another language which is a little bit peculiar is Persian. Now Persian has a strict SOV order but prepositions. So despite the formal clarity of basic word order patterns and head modifier ordering, languages are often not that well organized and are open to exceptions. Well, and there are further problems. In specific texts, whether spoken or written, we may find that the basic word order of a language is much less clear than elsewhere. Suppose you had to work out the basic word order of present-day English on the basis of this text. What would it be? Well, this text, of course, is part of a famous song, so let's listen first. Okay, here we go. Nights in white satin, never reaching the end. Letters I've written, never meaning to send. Beauty I'd always missed with these eyes before. Just what the truth is, I can't say anymore. Yes, I love you. Yes, I love you. Oh, how I love you. Well, a wonderful song, I think. Well, but let's now concentrate on linguistics again. So, I suggest you stop the e-lecture here and try an analysis, a functional analysis in terms of subject, verb, object, adverbial and complement. So, are you ready? Here are the results. Now, in the first sentence, we clearly have an SVO structure. The verb reaching, however, is non-finite, but that's the freedom of the writer of the lyrics. Nights in white satin, never reached or reaching the end. Then we have an object fronted structure, letters with an internal relative clause, never meaning to send, and there's no subject. So an object verb structure. Beauty I'd always missed is clearly object fronting. The object beauty precedes the subject I, and then we have the verb and some adverbials. And the final line, what the truth is clearly the object. It is an object clause. I is the subject and can't say the verb. So here are the ordering patterns. Well, what do these patterns suggest? Is English then a modifier head structure language where the object precedes the verb? Well, probably not. But what I wanted to illustrate with this is that we have to be very careful with the choice of data if we want to establish the basic word order of a language. So let's summarize. The syntactic classification of languages is mainly based on the sequence of the functional elements of clause structure in declarative sentences. That is, on the basis of subject, verb and object. Since most languages, under certain circumstances, may deviate from their basic word orders and allow alternatives, for example object fronting in present-day English, additional ordering patterns may provide further information. The illustration and exemplification of the way languages arrange their central functional elements has been the goal of this e-lecture. I hope I could help you a little bit on that. This e-lecture introduces the central properties of case in a cross-linguistic fashion using examples from a variety of languages. In particular, we will exemplify the notion of case using examples from several languages. We will draw a distinction between direct and oblique case, and we will define some aspects of what is known as case syncretism. The term case, Latin casus, is a name for the entire class of relational categories applicable to noun inflection or declension, reflecting the roles played by nouns in sentences. And languages differ enormously concerning the complexity of their case systems. Let us illustrate this on the basis of the morphosyntactic part of some entries from the VLC language index. At one extreme, we have languages such as Finnish, a Uralic language. And this language is well known for its elaborate case system. Now here are our examples. The woman is sleeping.
Nainen nukkuu.
And we're interested in the form of the item woman. Our second example,
Mies näkee naisen.
the man sees the woman. And here is example number 3.
Mies antaa naiselle kirjan.
The man gives to the woman the book. The man gives the woman the book. And in each example, we have a morphologically different form of the Finnish equivalent of woman. Nainen in the nominative case, marked as a subject. Naisen in the genitive case, marked as an object. And naisele, marked in the allative case, which is something like to the woman. Thus, in summary, a very complex case system. And this case system is even more complex if we take cases that not only define syntactic functions, but semantic relationships such as the partitive, for example. Korean auton, I fix the car, is first of all the genitive, as we know. Now if we compare that with Korean autoa, I fix some car, here we have the partitive, a different morphological structure, and he is in the car is marked as the inessive, some sort of locative relationship. And finally, autostar, he's getting out of the car, the so-called elative case. And I could go on with all the other examples that you can find here. If you consult the language index entry Finnish, you can access all these examples. So Finnish is extremely complex as far as its case system is concerned. Other languages, for example the Sino-Tibetan languages, have relatively little or no case marking at all. Here is an example from Mandarin Chinese. Well, again, the woman is sleeping.
女人睡觉。
Now compare that with the man sees the woman.
男人看见女人。
And finally, the last example, the man gives the woman the book.
男人给女人一本书。
Well, and in all three cases, in all three examples, human female, the Chinese equivalent of woman, does not undergo any morphological alternation. So there is no case marking in Mandarin Chinese. Well, and what about English? Well, English has only retained few cases from a formerly very complex case system, which is illustrated over here. So these are the two cases that are generally left in present-day English. For some pronouns, a maximum of 3 cases can be defined. The nominative case, the genitive case, and a case form that is used if these pronouns occur in object positions, so let's call it the object case. Well, and in standard nouns, as you all know, we have just two cases left. The genitive case again, well, and an unmarked case, we might want to call it common case or oblique case. There are several terms around. The common case is thus simply the form that is used when the genitive is not used. Despite the slightly more complex case system for pronouns, one could, perhaps with some care, define English as a language without case distinctions at all, but with a special form, often in a sort of periphrastic, that is complex phrasal form, used to express relationships such as the possessive, partitive, etc. You know, the of genitive. Having exemplified variants of case, let us now look at the classification of case in general. The notion of case can be subdivided into two central categories: direct case or grammatical or syntactic case, and the oblique case, that is also referred to as semantic case. Let us start with the treatment of the oblique or semantic case. Now, the oblique case, as I said, also referred to as semantic case, can be expressed in many ways. Here are two examples from present-day English. In the car versus into the car, and the difference, as you may know, is a difference between a location and a direction. How do we express that in present-day English? Well, the semantic relationship is expressed via specific prepositions. This can be contrasted again with Finnish, where case endings do the same thing. Autossa versus autoon. And then we have split systems. In German, for example, this semantic relationship is expressed via a preposition. However, the preposition is identical for both semantic relations. In dem Auto, in das Auto. To draw a distinction, case inherent in the determiners takes over. In dem Auto, the dative case, which marks the locative relationship. In das Auto, where das is the accusative case, could also be the nominative case, but here accusative, and it marks a directional relationship. Oblique cases denote a semantic content that is not dependent on structural roles. Here is a collection of the semantic relationships expressed by the languages in the world, either by means of prepositions or postpositions or by means of case. We have the partitive relationship, something like some car, the commutative relationship, something like with a car, the instrumental relationship, something like by, again with, by means of, and then we have locative and directional relationships such as the translative into the car, the elative out of the car, the illative into again, and the allative to another object. And also we have special relationships such as the essive, which means as a car, the abessive without, and the instructive with, and the adessive relationship, which means on. Having discussed the variants of the realization of the oblique case, let us now turn our attention to the discussion of direct case. Now, direct case, as I said already, also referred to as grammatical or syntactic case, is used to mark the basic syntactic functions subject, direct object, and indirect object. Cross-linguistically, 6 direct cases can be identified. For subjects and direct objects, we find the nominative, the accusative, the absolutive, and the ergative cases. And for indirect objects, we have cases such as the dative and the genitive case. For the marking of these cases, 2 possible systems can be distinguished: the accusative case system and the ergative case system. Now, in the accusative case system, or case marking system to be precise, subjects are generally marked by the nominative and objects of transitive verbs by the accusative case. This system can be found in most of the Indo-European languages. Usually, the nominative is the base form of a noun and the accusative an inflected variant. Let us look at the main variants of the accusative case system. Here is the first one, a language with formal direct case distinction, and the example I chose from the VLC language index is Russian. Again, I have the three sentences. The woman is sleeping, the man sees the woman, and the man gives the woman the book. Let's listen first.
Женщина спала. Мужчина видит женщину. Мужчина дает женщине книгу.
And as you can see, we have three forms: женщина, женщину, and женщина. So clearly a formal case distinction, a direct case distinction in terms of different suffixes. The next variant exhibits a language with partial formal direct case distinction, and the example I chose here is German. And since I'm a native speaker of German, I can produce these sentences myself. Again, same sentences: der Mann schläft, die Frau sieht den Mann, and die Frau gibt dem Mann das Buch. The man is sleeping, the woman sees the man, and the woman gives the man the book. Now, what is happening here? If you look at the noun itself, Mann, man, there is no distinction at all, but here case is expressed by the inherent marking of the determiner der, the nominative, den, accusative, and dem, the dative case. Well, and finally, there are languages with no formal direct case distinction, and the example, of course, we all know is present-day English. So a quick look at it may suffice. The man sleeps, the woman sees the man, the woman gives the man the book. So in each case we have the man with no case marking at all. Let's now contrast this with the ergative system of direct case marking. Well, this system draws a distinction between the case marking of the subjects of intransitive and transitive verbs. The Caucasian and the Australian Aboriginal languages typically use the ergative case marking system. Here is an example from Georgian. Now, let's first of all listen, and again we have the two sentences: the man is sleeping and the man sees the woman.
Kats stinavs.
Quite interesting. Kats tsinas, and kats involves an ejective consonant, a typical feature of Georgian. And if you contrast that with the second sentence, the man sees the woman,
Katsi ხედავს ქალს.
we have katsi, and clearly we have a special case for the subject in the transitive context. See is a transitive verb, monotransitive, and sleep is used intransitively in Georgian. So clearly the base form, the absolutive form, is used in the intransitive context, and the ergative case is used in transitive context. Having defined the various types of case, let us now discuss the question: what happens if a language has little or no case marking versus languages with very elaborate case systems as far as the syntax is concerned? And this leads me to the discussion of case syncretism. As you may know, English underwent several changes from its early period Old English until today. One change was the weakening of the case system, technically referred to as case syncretism, that is, a mechanism of merging formally distinct case forms. In Old English, for example, the period from 600 to 1100 after Christ, there were four cases: 4 morphological cases. Here we have the example of the noun tail, talu tale, tale and tala, talum tala, 4 different forms. In the singular, the syntactic cases talu and tale were clearly distinguished. In the plural, the nominative and the accusative forms had already merged. Later, these forms were leveled to 2 cases in present-day English, the genitive case and the unmarked or common or oblique case. Now, the leveling of cases brought about a tendency towards a more rigid word order. Why is this so? What has word order got to do with case systems? Well, let us illustrate the necessity of fixing the word order where you have fewer cases using an example from German. Here it is. The example is quite simple. Der Mann sieht den Hund, the man sees the dog, and der Mann is clearly marked as a subject by means of the presence of a nominative marked determiner der. And den Hund is clearly the object because we have an accusative marked determiner den. Well, and this means we can easily change the sentence to something like den Hund sieht der Mann. And the situation is the same. Irrespective of the word order, we can interpret this sentence as a sentence where der Mann is the subject and den Hund is the object. So word order does not play a role. But what about if we take names? Maria sieht Paul, Mary sees Paul. Now here we just have the noun, we don't have a determiner. Well, in this case, we have a problem. If we take Paul into the first position, then Paul clearly becomes the subject, whereas Maria becomes the object. So as soon as we drop the case marking possibilities, word order takes over. The first item becomes the subject and the item that follows the verb becomes the object. So without case marking, without case marked determiners in German, the only way of interpreting noun phrases as subjects or objects is word order. With case marking, word order is no longer necessary as the key factor. Let us summarize. In this e-lecture we saw that all languages have to express syntactic as well as semantic relations. Some languages, like Finnish, use case to do all this. Others apply a combination of adpositions, that's the head term for prepositions and postpositions, and word order. We also found out that case systems can be defined as direct or syntactic on the one hand and as oblique or semantic on the other. Yet, as we saw, some of the direct cases can serve oblique functions as well. Thus the terms syntactic and semantic case are misleading to some extent. As we saw, German, for example, marks prepositional phrases with the accusative, dative or even the genitive case. I didn't give you an example with a genitive case, here is one, wegen meiner Kopfschmerzen, because of my headache. And so all this depends on semantic factors. But all these cases are used as direct cases too. And finally, I hope to have briefly illustrated the effect of case syncretism, that is, a mechanism that has affected the English language from its origins until the present day. The mechanisms that underlie case syncretism have not been mentioned in this e-lecture. To find out these mechanisms, I recommend you to consult our language typology e-lecture, Types of Language Change Part 1.